podcast people. This is Drug Dealing episode 4. Welcome back. Thank you for listening as always. We have myself, Shivu, Kenny as well. Just two of us today versus an interview this time. People were sick of talking to us, so it's just you and me, Kenny, talking about the space. So today we have a really interesting topic to discuss. We could probably say this is, definitely the most popular drug class at this juncture. And by some measures projected to be the largest drug class in terms of prescriptions in, our known human history so far. So we'll see at this juncture. So we're talking about GLP-1s today, and not necessarily GLP-1s for weight loss or for diabetes, but there was some interesting data last month from Lilly on their oral GLP-1. So to date, all of these GLP-1 drugs, or the majority of them, and the ones that are getting the most uptake, have been injections of various peptides that agonize the GLP-1 receptor. And Lilly came up with an oral version that prompted me and Kenny to kind of think about, the trade-offs between oral and injectable forms, especially for this class, and where that might go, as well as, as new data emerges about the understanding of this class and what other diseases they could potentially move into. It seems to be that the effects of these drugs are much broader than we thought. It's bigger than just weight loss. It's bigger than just rebalancing your blood sugar. The mechanism of action of these drugs seems to be having, reasonable therapeutic effect in diseases of the brain, which is obviously kind of a very difficult area to develop drugs in. If you look at the history behind drug development in CNS diseases, I mean, it's absolutely riddled with failure. Some of that's placebo effect. Some of that is, it's just really hard to get drugs into the brain because of the blood-brain barrier. Some of that is just, I think probably a lot of that is just a poor understanding of the diseases that those drugs are being developed for. So that was kind of the topic that we wanted to discuss today: GLP-1s in oral, and then the expansion of GLP-1s potentially into diseases outside of kind of the comorbid metabolic conditions.
Yeah, that's right, Shivu. I think it's easy to gloss over how difficult CNS or those types of diseases can be to run studies. There's been so many trials. This is somewhat a tangent, but it's relevant to what we're doing. Schizophrenia drugs. It's been hard to get something new approved because the placebo effect in that space is so difficult. So when you think about that as a potential proxy for how these studies can go, you're looking at a potential graveyard where you can spend a decade or two trying to develop something and forget about all the money you might spend. Think about all the patients who are enrolling into these studies where you're trying to get something done and it just doesn't work. And so this space has been riddled with issues. And what I found interesting about this is when I was catching up over lunch with a friend about this space who works only in neurodegeneration, he was frankly amazed at the potential mechanistic rationale for a GLP-1 in this space. And when I asked him, why do you think it works? Mid-chew, he stopped and said, I don't know. And it was because it bothered him that much. Manners are out the door. It really bothered him that he couldn't understand, that we don't know why it works. But he said the data are so compelling, we must respect it and understand what's going on. So I think it's great that we're talking about it today. You opened with Lilly's oral data, and I wanted to ask, do you think it makes sense to move into another oral in the space as a potential analog for how we might think about this and its success and how things might roll out?
Yeah, let's talk about it. And then we can kind of highlight some of the orpho data at a high level as well as we get into it.
So many people probably know about Novo's injectable drug, Wegovy. The generic name of that drug is semaglutide, and there is an oral version of that. And so this is what I was alluding to, that could Lilly's oral data perform similarly, better, or worse than this oral semaglutide, which was called Rybelsus? That was its brand name that many people might have seen in commercials about. So let me look a little bit of history on Rybelsus, Shivu, and audience. Why is this important for us to think about? Well, it's the first oral GLP-1 to be approved. This was approved in 2019. Fortunately, what was happening immediately after that? The global pandemic. So imagine trying to launch a new drug that providers did not know very well during a time where you can't even see your patient. So that became very difficult. And Novo cited that as one of the reasons why the launch struggled. It initially was not even approved in diabetes, in rather weight loss, but it was actually originally approved only in type 2 diabetes, but not as the first medication you take. You have to take some other ones first. And so the label, when you think about how doctors were allowed legally to prescribe this, it was very narrow. So that was another thing that restricted the drug, and that actually changed in 2023. It was finally approved later for type 2 diabetes as an initial treatment. So those are some of the initial hurdles that explains the last 5 or 6 years, initially how the drug was doing. And then as time passed, uptake started to get a little better, but it didn't really take off. And so there's more reasons if we think about, well, COVID's over. We can't blame COVID forever for everything. What else is going on? One of the issues that's common in our space, Shivu, adherence. Does the patient stay on the medication? And actually, I thought this drug would be easier for people to take, but it has some challenges. So I have an example of a loved one who tried to take it and struggled. But I'll go first into the pharmacology, some of the chemistry. So these drugs are not meant to be oral. I think it's nothing short of an epiphany in chemistry that these are actually formulated to take orally. And these drugs orally have very low bioavailability. One of the aspects that helps that is a chemistry modification. It's basically an enhancer, and it's called SNAC, SNAC. This is sodium and amino caprolate. Not to bore you with some of the details, but it's important to keep in mind that this is not the original form. There's been a modification to semaglutide. And what this does is it protects semaglutide from the stomach acid, and it facilitates absorption in the stomach lining. Unfortunately, due to these aspects of being oral and facilitating absorption, there's some chemistry hurdles here where patients must take the pill. So you take the pill and you have to wait at least 30 minutes before eating, but you can't wait more than 60 minutes. Otherwise, your side effects get worse. So what you have is a very rigid time window for a powerful medication that many people may not understand. Many people know the drug as a shot. Oh, I'm just going to take this as a shot. I only have to take it once a week or so. That's pretty easy. I don't have to worry about when and how I eat. But if you don't get it right, the drug actually won't work as well. And so I personally know I mentioned a loved one who was on this medication, and this person did not understand when to take the medicine, when to eat. They were confused. And as is common for people on this medication, they're on others. So then the question is, wait a minute, if I take this pill and I have to wait 30 minutes, should I not also take other medicines? Or should I take another pill 30 minutes before this one? And they're starting to lose track, and they're looking at their day as a stopwatch. When do I do this and not that? And then for most patients, they're not going to be that adherent to some of these challenges. And so I finally had to explain to this individual, if you want to get it right, bring the food up to your mouth at 29.59 and start chewing. That was the best way for me to explain. But if you think about all the issues I highlighted with compliance and all those other things, and the fact that the drug was launching during this time, you can see why it was so difficult and why it initially didn't work. So when you and I chatted offline about Lilly's oral, oh, what does this mean? I immediately thought of Ribelsis, and I wanted to chat with you about, well, Shivu, how does Lilly's drug compare in terms of this? Is it the same? Do we know if there's been chemistry modifications done? Does it have compliance issues that maybe Lilly is very savvy? They might have addressed up front. They might have put that into their studies. I don't know.
Yeah. So from what I've been able to uncover, it doesn't seem that orfo. So the name of the drug is orforglipron. A lot of R's and next to consonants and stuff that make this very difficult to say. But we'll call it orfo for short. But it's an oral GLP-1 receptor agonist. And when we were kind of discussing about some of the, I guess, let's call them dosing quirks of the previous generation of these oral GLP-1s, I was surprised to kind of hear, the story about, what your loved one went through. It doesn't appear that this version of an oral GLP-1 has those. It doesn't seem to have the same eating restrictions as to, hey, you have to be, on an empty stomach and, wait 30 minutes, but not more than 30 minutes, not more than 60 minutes type of thing. So, I mean, in terms of the logistics that it takes to take this drug, it seems to be significantly simpler, which I think is an intentional design choice, right? Oftentimes drug companies look at ways they can build in theoretical differentiation into a program, right? Into the design of a molecule. And then you run the studies to see whether that theoretical differentiation is actually manifesting into, actual differentiation. It doesn't seem that, these drugs have that downside, let's say. And so perhaps there's an argument to be made that the way that this drug is designed will actually, you know, lend itself to greater adherence. But to the adherence point, right? I mean, the reason why we bring it up is that, as you said, these drugs are injectables right now, like they're injected peptide, hormones basically. But despite how well these have done in the market, people don't stay on them, forever, right? Some of it is people are losing too much weight and they don't want to lose all the weight that they've lost from it, and they want to gain some weight back, so they come off of it. A lot of it is, financial, right? These are expensive drugs. A lot of insurance plans don't cover these yet. A lot of employers' insurance plans don't cover these yet. So patients are forced to pay out of pocket a lot of times for them. With the weird mechanics of how drug pricing works, sometimes, which is, we can probably save this conversation for another day. But with the weird mechanics of how drug pricing works, sometimes it's cheaper to pay for things out of pocket than it is to pay for with insurance. And a lot of insurance plans don't cover this. So a lot of patients do need to pay for things out of pocket. I think that's why you see a lot of the GLP-1 companies strike these deals with these telehealth companies to kind of secure supply. And, both Lilly and Novo, kind of the two leading GLP-1 companies, have kind of direct to consumer channels that they've developed that you can get these drugs for. As long as you have a prescription for it, you can basically, Lilly or Novo will basically ship this drug to your house. You don't get the injectable pen version. You kind of get a standard vial that you'd have to inject yourself with, a standard syringe. But a lot of patients, again, these drugs get too expensive, and eventually they fall off from taking it for that reason as well. Some of it is just like injecting yourself is uncomfortable for a lot of people, right? A lot of people don't like, taking an injection. I imagine your loved one probably had the option of, hey, take this injection once a week, or do I take this pill, and didn't know that they were getting themselves into, oh, well, I have to I have to have only this much water, but not this much water. And, I have to wait this long between it. So, I mean, all these little points of friction, I think, are intentional design choices, and make a big deal as to how compliant a patient is to taking their medication.
No, I think that's spot on. And it's easy to overlook, but what does the data tell us? I think that's really interesting as well. And so when you and I were studying some of this, some of the metrics in this space, it looks like the average treatment duration is only 7 to 8 months. But we know these drugs must be taken chronically, otherwise you lose the benefit. And a lot of patients rebound. So go back to the loved one I shared with you. What I think is also interesting is the drugs are so powerful, and the way some people think about it who work in the fitness space is it fundamentally changes your relationship to food. And so what I thought was interesting was, at least in this loved one who's over 65. So we're not thinking maybe the standard population. Over 65, you have to think about other issues as they get older. This person lost so much weight. It was well over 11%, 12% of their total body weight. So it's perhaps in line with the clinical studies from what you'd expect with some variability. But this person was actually a super responder on the A1C metrics. So the studies for Rybelsus suggest you get a 0.8, 0.9% A1C improvement. This individual got a 1.8% and plunged all the way down from 7.2 to 5.4. Now think about 5.4. Sounds great for you or me. But if you're over 65, you can actually get pushed into a hypoglycemic space. And now you're talking about someone who has blood pressure issues as well, fall risks, passing out, things like that. So what ended up happening to this individual was, because we're talking about treatment duration, right, Shivu? Like, why are some people aren't on it? This person finally did become compliant with that 30 to 60-minute window. However, their body responded so well, medication was too strong. And so he had to get off of it and went to a metformin regimen, 2,000 milligram extended release. And to his credit, he was actually able to keep the weight off, but he can't go back on a GLP-1 now. It's too risky and too strong. So one of the things I wonder about this space is you induce these amazing benefits, but if you're not able to sustain those benefits, because we know how the lifestyle of modern day is, it seems to be one of those things where, are you episodic then? You're on, you're off, you're on, you're off. And that to me sounds like it could be very difficult for not only the patient, but for your body as well. Think of the whipsaw you put your metabolic parameters through. And as we're going to get into now, that whipsaw is probably not good for your brain. And these medicines seem to have profound impact in the central nervous system, which we're just now uncovering.
Yeah, incredible amount of impact. And I mean, maybe just thinking about this part of why we wanted to talk about this topic today was that, a lot of the care in CNS diseases is from oral drugs for the most part. Some of that is just like a historic thing of, hey, these are you know, drugs derived from chemistry are typically oral in nature. And those, have been kind of the ones that have been pursued for those types of diseases. But, it's interesting that this is kind of more of a protein based drug that is, being successful in these. Obviously, there's certain indications like migraine now has a lot of antibodies you can take for getting a migraine. And, biologic drugs have started to really penetrate into in certain CNS indications. Um, but it's interesting, kind of as more of this GLP-1 data has come out, we're starting to learn about all the layers of mechanism of action that these drugs are able to induce. But so maybe we can start there from like a mechanism perspective. What do we know about how these drugs work from the data that we've seen in diabetes and in obesity? And look, what are we starting to uncover about some of these MOAs as we, learn more about the effects of these with in people with CNS disease?
Yeah, I think it's good to start there. So I'm putting a graph up on the screen first before we get into the mechanisms of some of the things you and I want to talk about. Just look at this impact in the space. There's been so much activity. Look at the x-axis over time. I mean, this is nothing short of meteoric. And if you look at the GLP-1 receptor agonists, their activity has exploded. And to me, it's one of those situations where that was interesting because it was through the metabolic lens. And now when you open it up, you can actually see, I wouldn't be surprised at all, Shiva, if you look at the green part of this graph, it talks about clinical trials. Those are largely through the lens of metabolic dysfunction. So weight and diabetes, those types of things. If we uncover potential pleiotropic effects, as we talked about before, in other spaces, for example, CNS, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, I would almost put money on this green section going up. It actually plateaued, it looked like right around 2016 or so. That will not stay the same. There will be people pursuing other things because what if you combo drugs that maybe are known to be effective in Alzheimer's that don't impact metabolic dysfunction with this? You can start to get to a space where are we going to start to reverse some of these diseases? So I wanted to highlight this graph because it's also, Shivu, a very notable graph in terms of frankly how sales has looked as well. I think this is a very good proxy for how the space has performed, and that's why you see so much activity as well. So I wanted to share that, and now I want to move into this is a really interesting paper, by the way. We'll cite it at the end of our podcast in the links, but also wanted to highlight the impacts of these drugs in the CNS space. So we mentioned Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and addiction as potentially being very notable indications. And so I think this graph, I'll voice over some of the more detail, but I think this graph is really helpful to think about because many people, if they've looked into these drugs and what they do, it's actually mostly in the metabolic space, but now we're starting to see more. So let me walk you through, Shivu and audience, the Alzheimer's section. So what do we start to see in Alzheimer's patients? This is a scientific proposal. We'll see what KOLs think in a bit. But these drugs for Alzheimer's, it seems to reduce neuroinflammation and oxidative stress. It seems to improve the beta amyloid and tau pathology. It seems to support neurotrophic activity. And of course, you see benefits in insulin sensitivity. And then there's also benefits in autophagy. So that's the Alzheimer's section. And I know I went very quickly. These are just some of the scientific mechanisms that have been proposed so far. Let's move now into Parkinson's because it's not quite the same. So you get in Parkinson's mitochondrial biogenesis, some survival of neuronal cells, of course, reduction in neuroinflammation, reduction in alpha synuclein aggregation, and then, of course, benefits in insulin signaling. So those are some of the two indications that were not on the radar. I think the one that's probably somewhat intuitive, at least, is addiction, because again, I talk about professional trainers, people who help others work out and get exercise as part of their normal life. Addiction comes up because the trainers to me have said before, I don't know how those drugs work. It just seems to fundamentally change your relationship with food. So I think about those pathways, reward pathways, drug seeking behaviors, and maybe even some neuroinflammation as well, as potentially explaining why GLP-1 medicines could be effective in addiction.
Yeah, absolutely. This all, I this all rings very. like once you dig into it a little bit, it starts to make sense, why potentially these drugs might be working in these indications, right? But it speaks to kind of this broader um lifestyle habit that we have kind of in our society, right? Where, there is some level of, like, in Alzheimer's, for instance, oftentimes people call it like type 3 diabetes, right? There's like a metabolic dysfunction that is, driving Alzheimer's pathology in some sense, for maybe not for every single Alzheimer's patients, but for a large chunk of them, right? And improving your insulin sensitivity generally also like reduces your inflammatory profile. Maybe that's preserving specific, neurons in your brain and slowing the rate of degradation. All of that tends to, makes sense. And I think maybe it's worth kind of taking a step back as to, talking about like why studies are happening in some of these places, right? Like maybe with the NASH example, or I think the obesity example is probably like the cleanest one, right? Remember, these were drugs that were being used to treat type 2 diabetes. They looked at the studies, all these patients started losing a lot of weight as well. They started to optimize these molecules in different doses and different molecular designs, and figured out, well, hey, we can just give this to patients, and they'll, even people who aren't type 2 diabetics can lose a lot of weight in this. I think a similar story was there for NASH, right? Where they started to find patients who were, NASH is a metabolic disease. People's NASH was resolving less, liver fat, and so the interesting part about the CNS one is that this doesn't seem like a direct, like on the surface, it doesn't seem like this natural adjacency, right? I mean, like a recent approval in this space was for obstructive sleep apnea, right? Like
Mm.
GLP-1, it makes sense, right? Hey, if you're kind of overweight, you lose some weight, you have less sleep apnea. Things like, it would make sense for things like osteoarthritis, right? Where, where there's a lot of clinical trials being done. You lose some weight, there's less weight bearing load on your knees. Perhaps that kind of slows the rate of, the articular cartilage kind of getting deteriorated. Uh, but what was so interesting to me about the CNS diseases was, you know, it might be kind of the first place we're starting to see the weight loss effects separated from the other effects of these drugs, right? As you were mentioning with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, maybe a lot of that is derived by the reduction of neuroinflammation. The addiction pathway is super interesting, right? Like obviously there is uh, dopamine is this very critical hormone in your drug reward pathway in your brain. If you're addicted to, you could say that obese people, there's some level of like addiction to food, let's call it,
Mhm.
let's simplify it into those terms. If you apply that addiction to another type of substance, perhaps you can break it, right? And I think that's where you're starting to see some of this data emerge. In the post for my Substack that I wrote like a few weeks ago, the addiction one was kind of interesting because I went into it assuming that the data was going to look pretty good across all the substances you were addicted to, right? Like, smoking, alcohol, opioids, is kind of where most of the activity has been. But the data is kind of mixed, and it seems to move towards, there seems to be a separation based on the type of addiction that you have. Like the efficacy in things like smoking cessation and alcohol seem to be better. And then once you start to move into kind of opioid addiction, the data so far is like more mixed. So maybe there's some, interaction there with, how opioids work in your brain, right? Through kind of,
Mhm.
opioid receptors and, how those interact with the GLP-1 mechanism of action that we just don't, quite know yet. But I think it's a good reminder too, that not all these diseases aren't, created equal. Uh, and there's so much more that we're going to learn from kind of the swath of studies that are coming out in each of these very specialized areas.
Some of the medications you mentioned regarding addiction, substance abuse in particular, if these can help there, I mean, it could be such a paradigm shift in how this country is dealing with that particular pandemic. We've already talked about, Shivu, some of the scientific rationale, some of the clinical rationale. I thought it was interesting to highlight. I know this is just N of one, But just for our listeners and for ourselves as we think about the data, I always like to marry the data that we find in the scientific space with what a clinician thinks, someone who might run trials on behalf of a sponsor with the FDA, someone that actually sees patients as well, and maybe even someone in the rural community. I like to see how they think about these things, and so I pulled some of the comments from one. If you don't mind, I'll share a little bit of
Yeah.
that. So this particular KOL was referencing liraglutide, and in the study, it was I believe it was an Alzheimer's study, and it was presented recently. And this KOL said, "Well, when I looked at intranasal insulin, I was feeling like, if there's abnormal glucose utilization in the brain, something like that could make sense. So maybe that's the extending that rationale to GLP-1s. Maybe that's how some of the drug works. But this KOL thinks that the effects of these drugs are fairly pleiotropic. It's a word we've used already a few times on this call, and I think that's essentially one of the most interchangeable words with this class. When you think of one of the most pleiotropic drugs is frankly GLP-1s. And this we're still learning as we speak. And there's some suggestion, this KOL said, that there's impacts on neuroinflammation. It's one of the aspects I walked you through in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and addiction, but it's unclear definitively. And so the call moderator then asked, well, what do you think about, okay, so that's liraglutide, an older generation drug. We're on semaglutide now, and there's next gen, and then there's obviously dual mechanisms. What do you think about liraglutide versus something that's closer to semaglutide? And then, of course, extending the question further into other mechanisms. And the doctor responded right away and said, it's not answerable right now. Based on the data that we have, it's impossible to know. And he actually went through the old school way of thinking about how a drug is utilized. He said, I'm thinking of route of administration. He said, I think so, whether it's an oral or a shot, things like that. I think that is what's going to drive utilization of these drugs. And that's essentially a KOL saying, I don't know how they work. I want the one that makes it easiest for my patient to get the results. And
Mhm.
until I know how it works, I'm just going to go with what's been showing efficacy. And then eventually the space will figure out why they're working.
Yeah, and in doing the research for this too, the one thing that I came away with maybe a deeper appreciation was that these drugs don't seem to necessarily have to get into your brain, into pass your blood-brain barrier in significant amounts in order to generate these effects. And so there's been kind of a number of preclinical studies and clinical studies, and the collection of the data seems to suggest that, obviously each one of these molecules, whether it's semaglutide or whether it's tirzepatide, the Lilly drug, or liraglutide, some of the older generation ones, they all have varying levels of blood-brain barrier permeability. And even in your brain, different brain regions have different levels of permeability. Like as you get kind of lower into, your brain stem and sort of the older, from an evolutionary perspective, the older regions of the brain, those are probably a little more permeable. But as you get into kind of like the deeper parts of the brain, those are a little bit harder to get into. And the molecules that where most of the clinical data has come from, so semaglutide is kind of where a lot of the clinical data in some of these CNS diseases have come from. Semaglutide doesn't really penetrate your blood-brain barrier all that much. It does a little bit, but there's this paradox, right? Like even in deep brain regions, where, like your ventral tegmental area, VTA, kind of where your drug reward pathway is, even deeper parts of your brain, right? There's clearly these GLP-1 receptors expressed, but yet the drugs don't necessarily have to penetrate into the deep parts of your brain in order to have an effect. So all that is to say, we're still learning a lot about the way these work, right? There still seems to be some peripheral activity, maybe through kind of the gut brain axis, and how like the vagus nerve connects to your gut, that are, driving some of these effects, maybe, indirectly. But there is still, some level of kind of central direct effects of these penetrating your brain. And what we don't know yet is, all of these molecules thus far have not been necessarily like designed and optimized to penetrate your brain yet, right? I mean, in the same way that we were talking about the oral GLP-1s, right? Clearly, there was an effort by Lilly to go, we are going to design this molecule so that we don't have all the same dosing quirks that Rybelsus had, right? Um, Clear design choices and how you design a specific molecule, the structure of it, like have real effects on the dosing and how it's taken. There's multiple companies developing brain specific versions, let's say, of GLP-1s, and I think the part that we don't know yet is is more activation of these central
Mhm.
receptors, does it derive, is it necessary? Maybe not, right? Like kind of based on the initial clinical data that we're seeing. And we can kind of touch on some of the clinical data in the three diseases that we mentioned a little bit later, but is more activation better? And I don't know that we know, but that's some of the stuff that we're going to learn, right? As more novel molecules come out, as fit for purpose, let's say versions of GLP-1s come out that are, designed for CNS penetration. We'll start to learn is, the deeper these things can get into your brain, is that actually deriving like a clinical benefit or not?
I do wonder a lot about, the mechanisms, whether you target the brain or you're going into the systemic approach. Is there a trade-off there? I also wonder about Shivu is the loved one I mentioned who was on the medicine, was a super responder, and had to come off of it because of the weight loss induced. That may not apply to everybody, but I have noticed the empowering feeling people get when they're on these medicines. Some do work out more, and some worry about losing the muscle mass. So some actually increase their metabolic profile activity, their overall metabolic activity, rather, because this drug makes them feel so good. And some of them don't need to be on it. And one of the things I wonder about these medicines, amongst many, is if we know that there's a potential signal here that it can reverse things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, but you're actually responding to on the metabolic aspects, so traditional reasons why these drugs work in the first place, and you respond, say, on average, just as well. You don't need to be on it forever, but what does it mean if you have another disease that does benefit, like an Alzheimer's or a Parkinson's? Do you stop taking it? Is there a way to down titrate and then slip into a chronic or maintenance period where on a lower dose? I don't know how that works. My
Yeah.
understanding is typically if you take Ribelsis, you take it every day. You don't
Mhm.
skip around. If you're on the shot, you take it on your weekly or every other 2 weeks in paradigm. That's what you're supposed to do. Skipping around isn't an option. My understanding is on some of the titrations, I believe Ribelsis had a lower dose, or one of them had a lower dose you can kind of step up to. That's mostly to navigate the GI issues, but that's not
Mhm.
really to drive efficacy. So I don't know if you can ramp up to that. Can you ramp down on it as well? I'm not sure about that. But I think those are open questions in the space. First, we have to prove whether it actually is efficacious or not in these other diseases. And it's so heartening to see as someone in this space, someone with loved ones who are older, that there's potential mechanisms here. But I also wonder, how do you stay on it? Because these are tough drugs to take long term because they are so strong. So does the field, which has been trying to create stronger drugs for years now, do they almost essentially have to walk back some of that? You talked about Ribelsis and Kenny, how much water should your loved one take, that kind of thing. I wonder if you play those games with your own well-being because you know the medicine's too strong and your doctor might help you do that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I think the down ramping of the dose is super relevant to, even outside of these CNS diseases in the kind of the obesity and diabetes space as well, right? I mean, I think for a lot of people, right, taking an injection every single day of their life, doesn't feel great for them. I mean, maybe they feel amazing on it, and for some people, they're fine kind of taking it forever. But we're still learning so much about these drugs, right? I think, oftentimes when we're talking about dosing, right, we talk about dose frequency, and, these went from very inconvenient dosing frequencies to now being once a week. There's multiple companies now working on more extended versions of this where maybe you only need to dose once a month. I think Amgen's program is basically once a month, I believe. We can correct it in the show notes if we're wrong about this, but once a month sort of injection of a GLP-1. And it seems like they found in their study that even after people stopped taking their drug, there was a period at which the weight loss benefits were still sustained. And so it's just to say that all these drugs aren't created equal. Eventually, like, we're going to learn more about, is there a specific ramp down? Is there, de-escalation? Is there a specific de-escalation protocol that doesn't actually create this, rebound effect, right? Is there a specific, diet and, exercise regimen that is more beneficial for slowly ramping off of these drugs? Or is there certain patients where they shouldn't ever ramp off of these drugs, right? Um, there's so much we learn about how a drug works after it's approved.
Yeah. Well, that's why we have those post marketing commitments and the sponsor's responsibility. to the patient does not stop just because the FDA approves it. There's an ongoing monitoring. I don't think it almost happens in stealth, Shivu. I don't think people understand it very well. But there's a reason why if you call your insurance company on any medicine you're on, they always ask you, do you have any new side effects? Every time. They
Hmm.
still have to capture that data. If you tell a sponsor that, oh, I had this issue, that has to get captured actually legally in a very specific way and submitted to the FDA. Those are tracked actually in a affairs database. I used to use that all the time. I don't know if it's still active because of all the regulatory changes, but back in the day, there was a way for you to track that. And that was an interesting way for you to see before the sponsor might come out with an announcement or work with the FDA on a label change, how the data were trending. So to your point, we don't know a lot of these things, and I wonder how they might work. I still think the dosing will have to get modified to some extent for some of these diseases, which is a great thing to know that there's other options.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think over the course of this year, especially, we're going to learn so much about how these drugs work in a number of diseases, but especially in the ones that we were talking about, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and addiction. I think in the addiction case, there's, most of these studies are happening at academic centers, with patients who are obese and have these other diseases, or in some cases, just substance abuse disorder alone. There's a couple studies out of Colorado and Oklahoma State that are going to read out for alcohol use disorder probably second half of this year, maybe early next year. So we'll get a lot more data on that. I mean, the early data so far has shown, at least in patients with alcohol use disorder and who are obese, pretty significant reductions in drinking behavior. I think one study found that there was a massive reduction, almost like a 30% reduction in almost a 30% reduction in their likelihood to drink alcohol,
Wow,
which is pretty
that's amazing.
profound. There were studies that showed pretty significant reductions in like blood alcohol level. You know, like the placebo group. Maybe I can share this actually. This is one study. This is one study that looked at once weekly semaglutide in adults with alcohol use disorder. So again, we're speaking to promise of these diseases, of this class of therapies to treat these diseases. This is all still very early data, as you can tell. There's only 48 patients in this study. Only 24 of them got the actual drug. It was only in one center, right? So we're not saying there's anything kind of definitive about this. It's very important to run large multi-center randomized controlled studies for this type of thing to really assess whether the signal that you see in this study is beneficial or not, right? But for this specific study, right, if you look at the average amount of alcohol that was consumed by patients who got semaglutide versus the placebo group, it was about 34 grams versus the placebo group who was almost up to 58 grams of alcohol. I'm trying to convert in my head, like what does that mean in terms of beers and shots and glasses of wine? But I mean, you can imagine it's like a pretty significant amount there. And this is why I think people are really excited about this stuff.
That's so wonderful to see. I've actually not seen this before. I'm actually seeing it live with anyone else who hasn't seen it before. So you highlighted the caveats so well. 14 men, 34 women. We're not exactly even Steven there, but the 48 participants for us, for the listeners who may not know, 48 patients in a study is pretty small. I would call that really just a sample for how might things look in a larger study. This would essentially be a phase 2A proof of concept is how I would
Yeah,
think about this. But the other thing that's worth highlighting is you already said it, Shivu, more than one location. You want
yeah.
multiple sites, and that's why the data are more durable. But in itself, that's still compelling because it aligns with what we already know with addiction. I just didn't think it would translate necessarily to alcohol, but it makes sense in some ways. And look, you see that drop of say maybe a baseline of sub 60 to you said 34. I mean, that's a substantial drop. It's
Yeah.
not quite 50%, but it's not far. And I know there are several cases of people who wish they had some help, and this could definitely drive that.
Yeah, and pretty good effect sizes too in that last line there. I will say,
Yeah.
just maybe as a higher for the less initiated listeners who are kind of tuning in this and aren't drug development professionals, 48 is a small number, but like the n size kind of depends on like the disease that you're looking at. Like for rare diseases, 48 could be
Very true.
48 could be, you could get a drug approved with 48 patients on a study. But, for a disease like alcoholism that is pretty widespread in our population, 48 patients isn't going to cut it. But this is good for signal generation, right? Like, hey, we ran a small study. It seems like there's some effect here. Let's try and get more data and see if what we're seeing is real.
Yep. I think the one other thing I'll mention, since it's a one center, the fact that it's academic gives me a little more comfort than a sponsor. Academic centers tend to be a bit more balanced. Not always, but that's typically the case. But it's a
Yeah.
very promising signal. Seeing that is very, very wonderful.
Yeah. We can go into more of the data if you want. I guess one comment I was gonna make was even just seeing the efficacy of this class of therapy in some of these other diseases, especially in the neurodegenerative diseases, right? They're neurodegenerative because they get worse, over time, right? We also don't know in those diseases, right? The stage of intervention is very important. When you start to intervene for Alzheimer's disease and how that slows progression is important. Same with
Yeah.
Parkinson's disease. My understanding is typically these are all being tested in kind of more earlier stage patients where if you intervene earlier, perhaps you start to see the benefits over a longer period of time. Correct me if I'm wrong, like even NASH was that way, right? If you're like a F3, F4 sort of fibrotic, cirrhotic kind of patient, it's, certain classes of drugs just weren't going to cut it in those in that type of patients versus ones are sort of more better suited to intervene earlier.
That's correct. So as you progress to liver failure through the lens of NASH MASH, it is now officially MASH. But when you progress to late stage and liver failure, you pass through the F3 F4 stages, which are very advanced to in MASH. And typically your liver is starting to have significant issues at this stage and is generally heading into deep fibrotic development. And when the tissues are that advanced in terms of damage, the fibrosis is very difficult to reverse. So the thinking was GLP-1s would not be effective for the late stage MASH patient, and that it'd be better for the, F2, F3 versus the F3, F4 as we head into cirrhosis. So what I've also come to understand is there was some thinking. I remember the Lilly CMO years ago when I was working for Big Pharma. They said something along the lines of, "Well, we think tirzepatide has anti-fibrotic benefits." And I thought that was quite a claim because there was no evidence of that. And I didn't track that data. I since moved on into other therapeutic areas. Shivu, maybe it makes sense for us to do a follow-up call to talk about, interesting GLP-1 developments, and we can move more into the traditional space of metabolic dysfunction. Today was an interesting take on a hot space that maybe people haven't appreciated yet. But
Mm.
there was so much interest in that drug. But yeah, stage of development matters. And if the patient has progressed, there's no way the healthcare system will bear the burden of putting them on a medication that will not help them.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's more data to come in this space. I think the biggest readout that we're waiting for is the phase 3 Evoke study from Novo. So this is semaglutide in patients with Alzheimer's disease. And so that's, a phase 3 study, extremely large study. I'm looking at it now. I want to say it's, yeah, 1,840 patients, according to their clinicaltrials.gov entry, looking at semaglutide versus placebo in patients with Alzheimer's disease. So that's the one that we're kind of waiting for. And I think will be the first really, no, you don't want to say definitive, but first really meaningful answer as to whether are these drugs, the early effects that you're seeing in kind of these single arm academic center type studies, are they really able to be extrapolated into kind of large phase 3 randomized control studies?
Yeah, and what's interesting is this space is one of the hottest. You remember back in the day when it was oncology or nothing, and now it feels like a few years later, now it's metabolic dysfunction or nothing. And again, go back to this call. We're outside now metabolic dysfunction for these drugs. You could think of central nervous disease maybe as an extension of that, and maybe that gets folded into the umbrella. But there will be an ongoing stream of catalysts in this space for years. And I think the reason why there hasn't been that much M&A in the space is because of the regulatory and macro uncertainties that we're going through right now. I don't think any company can spend the kind of money on some of these biotechs when you don't know where things are going. And so there's so much flux right now, companies with their own assets, like your Lilly, like your Novo, the real juggernauts in the space. You mentioned Amgen. I think Roche has gotten into the space a little bit as well. I think they're going to try to do some stuff, and they're well resourced with machines to get things done. But it might be those big companies that drive some of the more meaningful innovation, while the small ones are frankly struggling. Because in this environment, some of the listeners may not appreciate, when you have this much uncertainty, the small companies struggle way more.
They
It's the
do.
big companies that just keep trucking because they can keep going. And frankly, they have friends parked in certain policy offices and cities in this country that they can keep things moving. And it's not a coincidence that Lilly has dodged a lot of the bullets coming from the policymakers relative to Novo.
That's a
It's a
great
stark
point.
contrast.
That's a great point. I mean, also in times like this, right? The bigger companies have bigger war chests, more money, and also bigger margin of error, right? I think the hard part about being at a small company is that um, you have to be laser focused on the one thing that is make or break for the success or failure of your company. For a lot of these big companies that, have GLP-1 assets in house, right? I would imagine for most of them, like the value of their stock price going up and down outside of like Lilly and Novo at this juncture, right? It's kind of being viewed more as upside, I would say, for the most part, right? They have these very well established franchises and in other parts of, other parts of their portfolio. If they crack into a GLP-1, indication or an adjacent indication, it's kind of all upside for them, and they have a lot of money to run the big, heavy, expensive, long types of studies that it takes for any number of these indications that we mentioned, right? Like, not once did you hear us talk about some really tiny rare disease with a common biomarker as an endpoint that could be run in a year, right? These are extremely large, long studies for very common diseases that affect human health.
Yeah. Yeah, they definitely have an advantage. So I think it makes sense for us to do another few episodes, at least on this space that evolves. I personally am so enthused to see all the positive data. And I know that there will be some issues. I know that, Shiva, just think about it. Say these get approved in just one of the major CNS diseases. Just imagine it's one of the bigger ones, Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. You can immediately envision the pushback from payers or other traffic cops, I guess you could say, on the system.
Yeah.
And while I understand that claim, I can tell you right now, if I had a loved one and that drug was approved and my loved one qualified for that medicine, I will do whatever I have to make sure they're on it. And so that's an adjustment the system will have to make.
Yeah, absolutely.
One nuance I think is worth sharing. It's easy to not understand the cost of a medicine, and this is somewhat not related to GLP-1s, but when you think about the cost of a medicine, you have to think about the balance of your life. And the net balance is typically positive when you take these medicines because you actually cost less to the system. Imagine as Alzheimer's patient, runaway disease. It runs your memory ragged, the trauma to yourself, to your family. You lose actually who you are over time, sometimes fast, sometimes slowly, but you do lose yourself. These medicines preserving that is essentially new life, and you no longer need that Alzheimer's care. Maybe you're able to be independent. And so those are the intangibles when people think about the price of a drug. I'm in the industry, so I clearly have a bias. What I try to remind them is, what is the alternative if you don't? And then also, I use other analogs, blind patients who can get their blindness resolved through some of these gene therapy treatments that we've seen approved in the last 5 to 7 years. The blind patient cost of the healthcare system is profoundly higher than one that does not have vision issues or can at least see. Just the fall risk itself, Shivu, breaking bones, all those other issues. So that's one of the things I want people to think about. You don't necessarily have to agree with me, but the analysis is very clear that medicines reduce overall your engagement with the healthcare system because you don't need it as much, which it's in itself is a major cost saver. And there are a lot of economic analyses on these.
I think, yeah, it made me think of this, which is the more data we get from this class of medicines, especially in these kind of big phase 3 studies that are, well run, the more approvals that occur for this class of medicines, the coverage should improve. And as I was mentioning kind of upfront, a lot of plans just don't cover these drugs at this point, right? That's why all these other channels have opened up for out of pocket payment to get these types of drugs. But as the benefit of these drugs are better understood and expand, the coverage for these drugs should get better, right? Because it's beneficial for the plans to cover the drug in that way, or for, your employer, the plan that you select through your employer to cover these drugs. So, I mean, I think that will all hopefully improve. And I won't speak for you, but I believe you're in this camp too. I mean, I'm excited to see where this field goes. I'm really looking forward to this phase 3 Evoke study data in Alzheimer's disease, supposed to come out sometime later this year, second half of this year, which I think will be a really big watershed moment for the GLP-1 class. I mean, that chart that you showed up front with the amount of activity in the space, a lot of that doesn't necessarily even like price in, what if one of these is really successful? What if this phase 3 Evoke study is successful in
Exactly.
Alzheimer's disease, right? I mean, that's a huge influx of patients that are going to probably, want to get on this type of medicine, a huge influx of clinical trials for, like we were saying, more CNS optimized versions of this program to try and figure out, how to differentiate from semaglutide. Um, and so it's a really exciting time. And I think, we're going to learn so much about this class over the next 5 years, especially, and where they work, where they don't, how to optimize them for specific diseases, and whether that's even meaningful, whether we even need to, optimize them for specific diseases or not. So it's an interesting time. I mean, those are probably the few things that I'm looking forward to and going to keep track of as this space matures. Is there any other kind of watch outs or, like upcoming uh questions that are still standing for you that we should all kind of keep track of?
We covered the ones that are not as well known with GLP-1s. I am curious to see how Lilly's oral will do. I'm going to study that data. Maybe we'll come back and talk about it again. I think it's also interesting to think about how this space might evolve in its bread and butter indications. Think of your metabolic dysfunction, so type 2 diabetes and weight loss. Well, are there going to be medications that can modify the mechanism so that it doesn't impact your muscle tissue as much? That sarcopenia has been something that's been a significant concern. I'm curious to see where that goes. I don't know where that'll go because when you typically modify the medications mechanism like that, you can have other issues. The side effect profile for GLP-1s is very well understood. You talk to a typical endocrinologist today, they understand how to titrate up and get the patients to have a better response on the side effects than what's in the studies. But when you make these other modifications, I wonder how that might evolve and change things. So I'm curious about that as well, because that kind of goes back to what originally made these drugs so powerful. I that's what comes to mind right now. My last parting comment for us to all consider is to remind ourselves how difficult Alzheimer's has been to treat. Dementia in general has been a graveyard. Any biotech or pharma that announced it was going to pursue a trial was considered throwing money away. Tens of millions, by the way. And by the time it was done, it was typically would cross a billion or two threshold. If you think of that molecule's inception from the bench to actually getting to pivotal studies where you need to get approved, to have something come in and surprise the world and say, wait a minute, this might work too. And you don't have to do all this work all over again. You might be able to run with it as is a gift to humanity. And that's why I think it's truly exciting to see how these things might evolve. That even if there's some benefit, maybe Shiva, we talk about stage of patient, maybe it's the early stage, maybe it's a small subset of individuals with a certain genetic profile that have a better response. So be it. What happens is as the boundary of science evolves and advances one step further, that then becomes a toehold for the next stage of development, for the next stage. And then one day, it's not going to happen tomorrow. One day there'll be a cure. And these steps will be looked back on in hindsight. It's like, oh, that was a meaningful advance. That's where we are today. We can be at the cusp of a major inflection point in some of the most intractable diseases.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree. I'm rooting for them. I want to see, hopefully the study's positive, and because it's positive, we learn so much about how these drugs work in that type of patient population. Same time, if it's negative, we'll still probably learn a lot about why or why not these drugs
Correct.
didn't work for that patient population. And, I think one thing that always keeps me motivated is that our industry does have a ton of resolve, like even in the face of failure in indications that, might be difficult to secure funding for, that have just been graveyards for his throughout history, right? We still see companies and innovative people pursuing, novel medicines in those spaces. So perhaps there should be more in certain indications as opposed to, centering around a few. Maybe that's a topic for for another day. But we continue to push forward, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this space shakes out over the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah. Super exciting.
Awesome. I think we can wrap up there. What we'll do is include links to some of the graphics that we pulled up in the show notes. I'll also link to the post that I put out on my Substack about the CNS disease and GLP-1s topic a few weeks back. And there's several other links in there as well to kind of additional research. And so hopefully you guys enjoyed this. I mean, it's our first, I think, flashing up visuals and that type of stuff. So if you enjoyed kind of seeing graphics and, that sort of thing, we'll try and include kind of more slides and even, images that we generate and visual aids that we generate to kind of help the conversation go. So thanks for listening to us as always. This is Kenny and Shivu signing off. Until next time for the next episode of Drug Dealing, we'll catch you then. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.